Well, I'll take the opportunity to introduce myself. I work at the Cato Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., and I cover consumer finance issues and financial technology. And as far as crypto is concerned, I spend most of my time explaining to policymakers why I don't think that the Howey test applies to functional cryptocurrencies and why there should be an off-ramp for token projects that have not yet released so that they don't so that the weight of the securities laws doesn't fall upon them from the moment they get started. So it's actually quite refreshing to be able to address a subject of more international interest and perhaps more hopeful and less technical and driving me less to despair the last couple of years, I have to confess, which is the application of decentralized networks in general and cryptocurrencies in particular to the promotion of human freedom. Because the Cato Institute is dedicated to promoting individual freedom and individual rights. But I think everybody who believes in human rights in general around the world should welcome the advent of decentralized technology. And I'm sure in the course of today, you've already heard very many use cases and examples laying out some of the applications that, particularly in developing countries, countries that are unstable, that have unreliable governments, that otherwise are enduring a tremendous amount of duress and pressure from existing institutions, can resort to crypto and the associated technology to improve their well-being or at least escape the worst characteristics of the regime they live under. Perhaps an example that comes to mind. Oh, sure. Sorry. Perhaps an example that that readily comes to mind is Venezuela, which for the last 5 or 6 years has been in a spiral of escalating economic decline, increasing inflation. Thank you very much. Increasing inflation and the inability to really escape the repression of the government very easily because there are capital controls, there are controls on the movement of people, and it's increasingly difficult to live a normal life if you remain in the country. And the use of Bitcoin has, to some extent, enabled regular Venezuelans, and particularly those who have connections abroad, to escape the scarcity and the shortages and the general repression that has happened. Of course, it's not a perfect solution. There are ways that the government very aggressively screens for mining technology in Venezuela, and given the shortages in electricity right now, of course, even running the network from Venezuela, or participating in it, has become very difficult. But that's just one example. And what I'd like to do in this presentation is to lay out to you, first of all, why I think it is that decentralized networks hold a lot of promise beyond the developed countries where it has so far made the most impact. But then secondly, pose to you a conundrum which I face, which is the trade-off between adoption of the technology by the general public and the preservation of the main virtue that would attract a lot of these places to decentralized technology, namely the absence of intermediaries. Because intermediaries in many countries are corrupt, or they're otherwise inefficient, or they're not working effectively. And that's what drives people. Venezuela is obviously the most egregious example of that, but that's what drives people to adopt a lot of this technology. Now, what is explained in the Nakamoto paper from 10 years ago and has come to light time and time again when it comes to cryptocurrencies is that they work best, or they are most attractive, where you have significant failure of intermediaries. Of course, a lot of people who were proponents of Bitcoin in the early days believed that central banks were bound to fail. Famously, the first transaction included an article from the London Times talking about the impending bank bailout, and there was certainly a political undertone about the existing monetary regime. But more generally, the failure of institutions is a tremendous propeller for the adoption of cryptocurrencies around the world. And it shouldn't be a surprise, because to the extent that we have successful intermediaries, we have human welfare rises and success. This is relating the score of countries' legal systems, according to the Fraser Institute Index of Economic Freedom, to their GDP per capita. And it basically is a summary score for the rule of law, for the quality of institutions, the quality of legal systems, bankruptcy regimes, banking regimes, monetary regimes, and clearly a very strong positive relationship emerges. The R-score is very, very high, and it's very difficult to escape low levels of GDP per capita unless one is able to find alternatives to inefficient intermediaries. You won't be surprised to hear that all of those countries at the bottom are the countries that we routinely describe as mired in a poverty trap, whether in Central America or in Sub-Saharan Africa or in certain parts of South Asia. And so improving intermediaries and giving the people in these countries, who by the way form the bulk of future population population increases, giving them alternatives that enable them to escape the path dependency of failed institutions is essential to increase their prosperity. So it's very much of human interest. And it's not just a question of economic freedom, because the spread of economic freedom is strongly correlated, again, with personal freedom, freedom of the press, freedom to move. The directionality of the causation is, of course, a matter of debate. What comes first? What drives the other? But clearly, there's a strong positive relationship, and where one dimension of freedom vanishes or declines, the other one tends to enter into decline as well. So if you're and most of the people in this room, I assume, are proponents of the spread of human rights and would like to see something like the conditions we broadly have in Western countries around the world, it is important to both push for economic freedom and for personal freedoms. Now, we live in a world of intermediaries, and we have for the better part of the last 300 years. Ever since our economy started to become more sophisticated, we started to have division of labor and the spread of specialization. We have relied on middlemen to connect people who are engaged in the exchange of goods and services, and we have used intermediaries to shape the framework in which we operate. But that doesn't mean that intermediaries are perfect. And particularly, I find that in general, if you look around the world, depending on the context, of course, you will find that there are 4 sources of intermediary failure. The first one is monopoly, meaning that one intermediary controls the entire market or a very large share of the market, is therefore not only able to shape the conditions of the market, but to keep people out, to exclude people, to censor people, to, because of people's views or their position or their aims, somehow make them unable to join the system. The second and third sources of failure are fraud and negligence, you know, the abuse of a platform or an intermediary, or the failure, some sort of data breach that might happen. But by far the most significant, as far as the statistics have shown is concerned, is government capture. The use of a limited number of intermediaries, or the licensing of intermediaries by governments around the world to their own ends, often to repress people, to keep them unable from being independent and autonomous and enjoying the full human rights. And so with cryptocurrencies, what we finally have is a technological solution that seems to suggest that we can have disintermediated exchange, right? This is the cliche, this is what everybody talks about. Disintermediation in payments, disintermediation in the working of computer programs, and various other applications. And to some extent, then we can escape these 4 sources of intermediary failure. Or at least we don't have to rely on intermediaries unless they work very well. Now, this is not just about the government. For long we have known that whenever there are very large operators in a market or in a society, they are able to shape the conditions as well. This is private sector actors as well. And John Stuart Mill, 160 years ago now, often talked about how society, if it didn't keep its guard and allow variety and diversity of opinion, might fall into, quote, a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression. And I think these fears are very often brought to light now with social media platforms and online platforms in general, because these are very large. They don't typically have much liability for the content that they either post or do not allow to be posted. And this is an ongoing controversial question, and nobody has really, or a lot of people have opinions, but there isn't really a consensus as to what the solution is to this ability of the private sector to potentially create a bottleneck in terms of whether political views or economic exchange or whatever else. It's an ongoing question, and so long as we only rely on intermediaries, we will continue to face it. In come cryptocurrencies, and they offer a lot of these advantages that I mentioned: disintermediated exchange, open access, the ability to change the consensus and the way that the program works according to what the constituency actually operating on the network wants, and by majority vote in a way. But what the early proponents, and I think still a lot of the participants in this market, really care about, or what their values are often reflected, and I'd be curious, you're working in the social impact area, about your feedback, are primarily privacy and autonomy. These are 2 values that both libertarian-minded people, but also crypto enthusiasts value. Being able to, without censorship, access a network and act pseudonymously or even anonymously to the extent that they can, and not necessarily to have to account to anybody because they're doing nothing wrong. And then autonomy, I think open access has a lot to do with this. Predictability is another condition that I would raise here, just because what we don't like is arbitrary behavior, is changing the rules in the middle of the game. And that's something that crypto has done very well. One of the reasons people join the network is that there's a great degree of certainty as to how the network will operate in the future. You cannot say that of intermediaries, who have discretion, first of all, but their incentives change a lot depending on their position. And this is not least the case of government institutions. But my problem, and this is the conundrum that I was talking to you about, is that those preferences don't necessarily align with the preferences of the general public. When it comes to joining services or joining platforms, being part of certain businesses, people care the most about cost and convenience and accountability. And I hope you will agree with me that there's still work to do in the crypto space. As far as those three are concerned, it's still very costly to operate on crypto networks. It's inconvenient if you want to avoid intermediaries. You can go through exchanges and you can use custodian wallets, but then you are really going back to an intermediated world. You're not really fulfilling the ideal that a lot of people have about complete disintermediation. And the last thing is accountability. People actually make mistakes all the time, and they're fat-fingered, and they make mistakes in typing things in. And they like to be able to call somebody up and say, I want this changed. If you make the wrong booking, you book the wrong flights, you can call the intermediary and say, will you change this on my behalf? We haven't figured out quite yet how to make that work through smart contracts only, without an intermediary, on decentralized networks. And so the question is, if we want to make this viable, and indeed adoption drives viability, to a very large extent, how do we persuade the public to adopt this without falling into the classic traps of intermediaries? That is monopoly, fraud, negligence, and government capture. Those three threats that continue to plague, whether it's a bank or a payment system or some search engine or anything else that connects people widely. Now, I've been warned that I have very little time left, so I will just conclude with a vision that was given 20 years ago about the internet, which was all about decentralization and the absence of concentrated power. Now, that was the vision then and continues to be the vision today, but there's been a great degree of centralization since. And a lot of the conflicts we see today are a result of the rise of the internet, rather than something that continues to be the case despite the internet. So I think it gives pause for thought as we approach the adoption of decentralized networks in future. Thank you.